James Cooper, a reclusive farmer with a gruff demeanor and a past he keeps buried deep. Known for his thick beard, hulking frame, and quiet kindness, James has built a life of solitude on his family's land. But when a notorious motorcycle gang known as the Storm Riders rolls into town, bringing chaos and fear, James finds himself thrust into the spotlight. What starts as harassment at the farmer's market quickly escalates into a confrontation that reveals hidden layers of a much larger operation, one involving weapons smuggling, criminal empires, and dangerous power brokers who operate in the shadows. As the Storm Riders and their mysterious backers tighten their grip on Eagle's Rest, James must confront not only the threats outside but the ghosts of his own past. With the help of unlikely allies, a resourceful mechanic, a determined sheriff, and a sharp-witted cafe owner, James must rally to protect the town and its people. As he uses skills honed long ago in a life he left behind, James uncovers a conspiracy far more dangerous than anyone imagined. But can one man's determination stand against a network of corruption and violence? And what will the quiet farmer reveal about himself when pushed to the edge? The sun rose over Eagle's Rest, casting a golden light on the town's modest farmer's market. Vendors lined the square, arranging fresh produce and homemade goods on wooden tables. The scent of baked bread mingled with the earthy aroma of fresh vegetables. James Cooper's large hands moved deftly despite their size, carefully placing heirloom tomatoes into neat rows. The man was a giant in both stature and presence, a black farmer with a thick beard that framed his stoic face. James was well known in Eagle's Rest, though he spoke little and rarely socialized. His farm sat on the outskirts of town, nestled against rolling fields and dense woods. It had been his sanctuary since he left the military over a decade ago, and he had worked tirelessly to restore the land. Farming gave him a purpose and a refuge, even if it kept him isolated. As he finished setting up his stall, James noticed Ruth Whitaker approaching. Ruth was a spry 70-year-old who ran the local bakery, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued. She held a basket of cinnamon rolls and a warm smile. "Morning, James," she greeted, setting the basket down on his table. "Thought you could use a little something sweet." James gave her a nod of thanks. "Appreciate it, Ruth." His voice was deep and steady, carrying an unspoken gratitude. Ruth leaned on her cane, watching him arrange the rest of his produce. "Looks like a good batch of tomatoes today." "They are," James said simply. "Same seeds my wife used to plant." Ruth's smile softened. She was one of the few who remembered Elise, James's late wife. Elise had been the heart of the farm, her joy infectious, and her laugh filling the fields like music. Since her death, James had grown quieter, retreating into himself. Before Ruth could say more, the sound of roaring engines cut through the morning calm. Heads turned as 5 motorcycles rolled into the market, their exhausts rumbling like thunder. The Storm Riders had arrived. The leader, Lance Python King, dismounted first. A wiry man with a leather jacket bearing the gang's colors, he carried himself with an arrogance that spoke of unchecked power. Behind him were 4 others, their expressions hard and unyielding. The market grew tense. Vendors exchanged nervous glances as the bikers began swaggering through the stalls. They tipped over displays and picked up goods without paying, their laughter grating against the air. James straightened his back, his eyes narrowing as he tracked their movements. He had seen men like them before, bullies, who thrived on fear. When Python approached his stall, James stood motionless, his massive frame casting a shadow across the table. "Well, well," Python sneered, picking up a tomato and tossing it from hand to hand. "Didn't know this market was operating on our turf. Time for you to pay your respects, big man." James met his gaze without flinching. "That tomato's $3, he said evenly. Python's smirk faltered, replaced by irritation. He stepped closer, the scent of alcohol and sweat heavy in the air. "You got a smart mouth for a guy trying to sell vegetables." James's hands remained at his sides, steady and unthreatening, but his voice carried an unmistakable weight. "Take the tomato, or leave it, but don't bother anyone else here." The two men locked eyes for a tense moment. Then, the wail of a police siren broke the standoff. Chief Anderson's patrol car rolled into the square, the officer's presence enough to send the bikers retreating to their motorcycles. "This isn't over, fat man," Python spat as he mounted his bike. "You'll learn how things work around here." The bikers roared away, leaving behind a shaken crowd. Vendors began whispering among themselves, lamenting the gang's growing boldness. Ruth placed a steadying hand on James's arm. "You all right?" she asked softly. James nodded, though his jaw remained tight. "They're testing the waters," he said. "Seeing how far they can push." Ruth sighed. "It's not just you they're pushing, James. They're pushing all of us." As the market resumed its hum of activity, James finished his sales for the day and loaded his truck. The weight of the encounter lingered in his mind, though he said nothing to the other vendors who offered words of support. He drove home in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. James's farmhouse sat at the end of a dirt road, its weathered exterior surrounded by fields of corn, tomatoes, and squash. The barn loomed nearby, sturdy but showing its age. He parked the truck and began unloading crates of unsold produce, his movements deliberate but heavy with thought. The evening brought a familiar rhythm. Feeding the chickens, checking the irrigation system, and locking up the barn. But tonight, James felt restless. He walked to the edge of his property, where the land sloped gently toward the woods. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. James leaned against the fence, his mind drifting to the past. He had been a soldier once, part of an elite Delta Force team. The skills he learned there had saved countless lives, but they had cost him dearly. When Elise died, he left that world behind, trading missions for the soil and seeds of his family's farm. Yet, no matter how far he tried to bury the memories, they remained close, like shadows he couldn't shake. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of a phone in his pocket. It wasn't his usual phone, but a secure device he kept for emergencies. The message was brief. "Package moving. 48 hours." James stared at the screen before deleting the message. His jaw tightened and his shoulders squared. The storm riders were trouble, but their behavior hinted at something far more dangerous. He turned back to the farmhouse, his mind already planning. The peaceful life he had built was under threat, but he wasn't about to let anyone take it away. Inside the farmhouse, James sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. The walls were adorned with photographs, some of Elise, some of the farm in its earlier days. He picked up a framed picture of Elise holding a basket of tomatoes, her smile radiant. "Wish you were here," he murmured. A knock at the door startled him. James opened it to find Ruth standing there, a casserole dish in her hands. "I figured you wouldn't have eaten yet," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. James set the dish on the table, unsure of how to respond. Ruth filled the silence with her usual chatter, commenting on the weather and the market's turnout. As she talked, James felt a small but noticeable warmth spread through the room. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice soft. Ruth smiled. "Sometimes even the strongest need a little help, James. Don't be too proud to let people in." As she left, James stood at the doorway, watching her disappear down the dirt road. Her words stayed with him long after the sun had set and the farmhouse had gone quiet. In the stillness of the night, James resolved to protect not just his farm, but the community that had shown him unexpected kindness. James Cooper woke before dawn, the lingering warmth of Ruth's unexpected visit settling into the corners of his mind. He busied himself with morning chores, his large hands moving methodically through the routines that had become second nature. Feed the chickens. Check the irrigation system. Inspect the perimeter of the farm. Yet, As the sun climbed over the horizon, his thoughts returned to the storm riders. Their presence at the market, the thinly veiled threats, Python's smirk, it all felt too deliberate. James had seen that kind of posturing before, years ago, in places far from the quiet fields of Eagle's Rest. After his chores, James returned to the farmhouse, where a small breakfast sat untouched on the table. He stared out the window, the vast expanse of his farm stretching before him. The land had been his sanctuary since Elise passed, a place where the weight of his past could be buried beneath soil and sweat. But now, the shadows of that past were stirring again. Later that morning, James drove into town. He needed supplies to repair the barn door, which had begun sagging on its hinges, and a few other odds and ends to prepare for the coming week. As he parked near the hardware store, familiar faces greeted him with friendly nods. Inside, James selected the items he needed, his presence filling the narrow aisles. The store clerk, a wiry man named Frank, rang up the purchases with a cheerful grin. "Storm riders are trouble," Frank said casually, bagging a box of screws. "I heard what they did at the market. You holding up all right?" James nodded, his voice low. "I'll manage." Frank leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "If you need help, folks around here won't hesitate. You've done right by this town, James. Don't forget that." The words surprised him. James wasn't used to being the focus of such sentiments. He thanked Frank and left, the supplies rattling in the truck bed as he drove back toward the farm. By the time he returned home, the weight of the morning's interactions had settled into his chest. James set to work repairing the barn door, the rhythmic pounding of his hammer offering a measure of solace. The farm was quiet, save for the distant calls of birds and the rustle of wind through the cornfields. But as the afternoon wore on, James noticed something out of place. A motorcycle engine roared in the distance, the sound growing louder until it stopped abruptly near the entrance to his property. James straightened, his hammer still in hand, and wiped the sweat from his brow. Walking to the edge of the field, he saw a lone figure astride a bike. The man removed his helmet, revealing a gaunt face framed by stringy hair. It was one of the storm riders, one of Python's lackeys, if James recalled correctly. "What do you want?" James asked, his tone neutral but firm. The man hesitated, glancing around as if unsure of himself. I got a message for you." James crossed his arms, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow in the fading sunlight. "Go on, then." The biker cleared his throat, his voice faltering. "Python says. He says you need to mind your own business. Stay out of ours, or else." James let the silence stretch, his eyes fixed on the man until the biker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Finally, James spoke, his voice calm and deliberate. "You tell Python this. I've lived through worse than he can imagine, and if he thinks he can scare me, he's got the wrong man." The biker blanched, fumbling to restart his engine. Moments later, he was gone, the roar of his bike fading into the distance. That evening, as James sat at the kitchen table, the day's events weighed heavily on his mind. He pulled out a weathered photograph of Elise, her smile warm and full of life. She had always believed in him, even when he doubted himself. "I wish you were here," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The secure phone buzzed again, cutting through the stillness. James hesitated before picking it up. The message was short. "Confirmed. Shipment scheduled 48 hours." James deleted it immediately, his mind already racing. The storm riders weren't just a gang. They were part of something larger. His instincts told him this was more than petty intimidation. He stood and walked to the living room, where a false panel in the wall concealed a small arsenal of tools and equipment. Most of it hadn't been touched in years, but James began methodically checking each item. He couldn't afford to be unprepared. The next morning, James returned to the farmer's market, his usual quiet demeanor masking the storm brewing inside him. Vendors greeted him warmly, but he noticed the tension in their voices and the nervous glances they cast toward the market's entrance. Ruth Whitaker approached, her basket of pastries swinging from her arm. "James," she said, her tone laced with concern. "You heard about what happened to the Clarksons, didn't you?" James frowned. "What about them?" Ruth lowered her voice. "Their produce stand got vandalized last night. Smashed crates, broken glass, just like what happened to your barn." James's jaw tightened. The storm riders were escalating, testing the boundaries of the town's patience. Ruth reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not alone in this, James. Don't forget that." He nodded, her words both a comfort and a reminder of the stakes. As Ruth walked away, James's gaze lingered on the market crowd. These were good people, hardworking, honest, and kind. He wouldn't let the storm riders tear this community apart. That evening, James worked late into the night, reinforcing the fences around his property and installing additional security cameras. The glow of the barn's floodlights illuminated his work, casting long shadows across the fields. He thought of the message he had delivered to Python's lackey. It had been a warning, but it was also a promise. James Cooper was not a man to back down, not when his home and his community were at stake. As he finished the final adjustments to the camera system, James stood back and surveyed his work. The farm had been his sanctuary, a place to heal and rebuild. Now it was becoming something else, a fortress. Inside the house, the secure phone buzzed once more. This time the message read, "They're watching. Be ready." James deleted it, his expression unreadable. He locked the door, turned off the lights, and sat in the darkened living room, the hum of the security system the only sound. The storm riders thought they could intimidate him. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The early morning sun broke over Eagle's Rest, casting a pale light on James Cooper's farm. His field stretched wide and green, bordered by thick woods that seemed to breathe with the dawn. James stood at the edge of his property, his eyes scanning the horizon. A restless energy coursed through him, a mix of anticipation and unease. The message from the previous night echoed in his mind. "They're watching. Be ready." He knew the storm riders wouldn't stop with threats and petty vandalism. Their attacks were escalating, and James suspected that something bigger was brewing. As he walked the perimeter of his farm, he checked the security cameras he had installed the night before. Each was positioned strategically, offering a clear view of the main road, the barn, and the surrounding fields. The feed streamed directly to a concealed monitor in his house, a relic of his military days that he had never imagined using again. The morning chores offered little solace. As he fed the chickens and watered the crops, his thoughts remained on the town and its people. He could still see Ruth's concerned face at the market, hear the nervous murmurs of the other vendors. This wasn't just about his farm anymore. The storm riders were trying to take something more, a sense of safety and unity that the town had always cherished. By mid-morning, James decided to drive into town. He needed to check in with Chief Anderson, the only law enforcement presence in Eagle's Rest. The chief was a good man, though his small-town resources were no match for the growing threat posed by the storm riders. As James parked near the station, the sight of Ruth Whitaker's bakery caught his eye. He hesitated, then decided to stop in first. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, the warm scent of cinnamon rolls and fresh bread wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. "Morning, James," Ruth called from behind the counter. Her eyes lit up, though worry still lingered in their depths. "You're up and about early." "Needed to check on something," James replied, his voice steady. He glanced around the small shop, its shelves lined with pastries and loaves. "How's business?" Ruth waved a hand dismissively. "It's steady enough. Folks are nervous, though. Those bikers, they've got everyone on edge." James nodded, his jaw tightening. "They're pushing too far. I'm heading to Anderson's office now." Ruth leaned forward, her voice softening. "You're doing more than most, James. Just don't take it all on yourself, you hear?" James offered a small nod of acknowledgement before leaving the bakery, Ruth's words following him like a whisper. At the station, Chief Anderson sat behind his desk, a stack of paperwork in front of him. He looked up as James entered, his face weary but welcoming. "James," Anderson greeted, gesturing for him to sit. "What brings you in?" "Storm riders," James said bluntly. "They're escalating. You know it as well as I do." The chief sighed, rubbing a hand over his balding head. "We've been tracking them, but it's not easy. They're careful not to cross certain lines. Petty vandalism, intimidation. It's enough to scare people, but not enough for a strong case." James leaned forward, his massive frame making the chair creak. "They're moving something. I don't have proof yet, but I know it. This isn't just about territory. There's more at play here." Anderson frowned. "You think it's connected to those weapons smuggling rumors?" "I'd bet on it," James said. "And if they're using Eagle's Rest as a waypoint, the whole town's at risk." The chief's face darkened. "I'll do what I can, but you know how limited we are. If you find anything concrete, let me know." James stood to leave, pausing at the door. "You're a good man, Anderson. But this is bigger than you or me. Be careful." That evening, James returned to the farm, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. He busied himself with reinforcing the barn doors and double-checking the camera feeds. The fields were quiet, the crickets beginning their nightly chorus as the sun dipped below the horizon. As darkness fell, James retreated to the farmhouse, where the concealed monitor displayed live footage from his cameras. For a while, the screen showed nothing but the stillness of the fields and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Then, just after midnight, movement caught his eye. 2 motorcycles crept down the dirt road leading to his property, their headlights off. James tensed, his hands steady as he zoomed in on the feed. The riders stopped at the edge of the field, dismounting quietly. They carried spray paint and bolt cutters, tools of petty destruction. James watched as they approached the barn, their movements slow and cautious. They clearly didn't know about the cameras. He could call Anderson, but it would take too long for help to arrive. Instead, James reached into a locked cabinet near the monitor, retrieving a heavy flashlight and a crowbar. He moved silently through the house, his steps practiced and deliberate. Outside, the bikers had begun cutting the chain on the barn doors, their laughter low and mocking. "You think this'll scare him off?" one of them whispered. "Big guy like that? He'll fold," the other replied, spraying a crude symbol onto the barn side. They didn't hear James approaching until it was too late. "Lose something?" he said, his voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. The bikers spun around, their faces pale in the flashlight's beam. James loomed over them, his presence like a mountain. "We were just," one of them started, but James cut him off. "You've got 10 seconds to get back on those bikes and leave," he said, his tone measured but unyielding. "If I see you here again, you'll regret it." The bikers hesitated, then scrambled toward their motorcycles, their bravado crumbling. They roared off into the night, their retreat as loud as their arrival had been silent. James watched them go, his jaw set. He knew this wasn't over. Back inside, James sat at the kitchen table, his shoulders slumping. He stared at the monitor, the adrenaline fading as the silence of the farmhouse settled around him. The secure phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. "Shipment confirmed. Tomorrow night. Stay ready." James deleted it, his mind already working. The bikers were just a symptom of a larger problem, one that was closing in on Eagle's Rest. He stood and walked to the window, the darkness outside feeling heavier than ever. But as he looked out at his fields, a sense of determination settled over him. This farm was his home, and this town was his refuge. He had fought harder battles before, and he would fight this one too, no matter the cost. The first light of dawn broke over James Cooper's farm, spilling a soft golden hue across the fields. James had barely slept, his mind racing with the implications of the midnight intruders and the message on his secure phone. The shipment was coming tonight. He stood on his porch, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, surveying the land that had been his sanctuary for years. It was hard to reconcile this peaceful view with the storm that was brewing. The storm riders had gone from a local nuisance to something far more dangerous. James couldn't shake the sense that the town's safety, and maybe its future, rested on his shoulders. By mid-morning, James was back at work fortifying the farm. He inspected every inch of his property, reinforcing weak points in the fencing, setting up additional motion-triggered floodlights, and rechecking the camera feeds. Each action was calculated, the product of years of military experience. He was hammering a loose board on the barn when he heard the rumble of a truck engine approaching. James turned, his gaze narrowing as a familiar pickup came into view. Marcus Shaw stepped out, his military bearing evident even in his civilian clothes. "Morning," Marcus said, walking toward James with a purposeful stride. James nodded, setting his hammer down. "Didn't expect to see you out here?" Marcus shrugged, his eyes scanning the property with practiced precision. "Heard about what happened last night. Figured you could use another set of hands." James studied Marcus for a moment, then motioned toward the house. "Come on inside." In the kitchen, James poured them both coffees. They sat across from each other at the worn wooden table, the quiet hum of the security monitor filling the space. "So," Marcus began, wrapping his hands around the mug, "what's your plan?" James leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Shipments coming through tonight. They'll use the back roads to avoid town, but they'll pass close enough to the farm that I can intercept." Marcus nodded slowly. "And after that?" "After that, we make sure they don't use Eagle's Rest for anything again." Marcus's gaze lingered on James, his respect clear. "You ever think about calling in more help? Anderson's a good cop, but this is bigger than him." James's jaw tightened. "Already have a line out. FBI's been tracking these guys, but they can't move without evidence. That's what tonight's about." Marcus sipped his coffee, his expression unreadable. "You've been planning this for a while, haven't you?" James didn't answer directly. "You don't prepare for a fight when it's at your door. You prepare long before it gets there." The afternoon was spent in preparation. Marcus helped James rig additional defenses around the property, tripwires that would trigger floodlights and makeshift barriers to slow any vehicles attempting to breach the farm. At one point, Marcus paused, leaning on a post as he watched James work. "You ever think about why you stayed here?" James glanced at him, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Eagle's Rest. This farm. You could have gone anywhere after everything." Marcus's tone was gentle, but his words carried weight. James straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Elise loved this place. Said it was the only place she ever felt at peace." He looked out at the fields, his gaze distant. "After she passed, I thought maybe it could do the same for me." Marcus nodded, the silence between them filled with unspoken understanding. As evening fell, Ruth Whitaker arrived with a basket of food. James met her at the porch, his hands resting on his hips. "I figured you wouldn't have time to cook," Ruth said, handing him the basket. "Not with everything going on." James's lips twitched in a brief smile. "Thanks, Ruth. You didn't have to." "Maybe not," she replied, her tone firm. "But sometimes people do things because they care, James. Don't forget that." Ruth's eyes drifted to Marcus, who was working on the far side of the barn. She raised an eyebrow. "Looks like you've got help." "Marcus showed up this morning," James said. "Good timing." Ruth nodded approvingly. "Well, if you two need anything else, you know where to find me." As she walked back to her car, James watched her go, her words lingering in his mind. The night came quickly, the sky darkening into a deep blue that was soon dotted with stars. James and Marcus sat in the farmhouse, the glow of the security monitors casting long shadows across the room. "Movement," Marcus said, pointing to one of the screens. James leaned forward. Two motorcycles and a pickup truck were approaching from the east, their lights dimmed. They moved deliberately, their route confirming James's suspicions. "Let's move," James said, standing. They exited the farmhouse, their steps quiet and measured. James carried a flashlight and a crowbar, while Marcus held a heavy wrench. The tools were simple but effective, chosen for their utility rather than lethality. The vehicles stopped near the edge of the property, just outside the perimeter fence. James and Marcus crouched behind a low row of shrubs, their eyes fixed on the scene. Three men stepped out of the truck, their figures silhouetted by the faint glow of the truck's interior light. James recognized Python immediately, his leather jacket glinting in the moonlight. The gang leader surveyed the farm, his posture cocky but cautious. "Spread out," he ordered. "Look for anything worth taking." The men began moving toward the barn, their flashlights sweeping the area. James signaled to Marcus, their silent plan already in motion. The first tripwire triggered a blinding floodlight, bathing the barn in harsh white light. The men froze, cursing as they shielded their eyes. "What the hell?" one of them shouted. James stepped into view, his massive frame cutting an imposing figure against the glare. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice calm but firm. Python recovered quickly, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think some lights are going to scare us, fat man?" "You've got one chance to leave," James replied, taking a step closer. "Or you'll regret staying." Python laughed, but the sound was forced. "You've got guts, I'll give you that." He gestured to his men. "Take him." The fight that followed was swift and precise. James and Marcus moved with practiced efficiency, using the environment to their advantage. One of the bikers charged, but James sidestepped and swung the crowbar in a controlled arc, knocking the man off balance. Marcus took on another, his movements fluid and deliberate. Within moments, the gang members were disarmed and incapacitated, groaning on the ground. Python stood frozen, his bravado faltering. He reached for something inside his jacket, but James closed the distance in 2 strides, grabbing the gang leader's wrist and twisting it until the weapon clattered to the ground. "You've made your choice," James said, his voice low. "Now live with it." By the time the FBI arrived, alerted by James's earlier tip, the gang members were restrained and ready for transport. Python glared at James as he was led away, but his silence spoke volumes. Marcus stood beside James, watching the agents work. "That was clean," he said. "Efficient." James exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders. One battle down, but it's not over. The farm was quiet again, as the last of the vehicles disappeared into the night. James and Marcus stood together, the stars above them a silent witness to what had just unfolded. "Thanks for having my back," James said. Marcus nodded. "Any time." As James walked back to the farmhouse, he felt the weight of the night settling over him. But there was also a spark of hope, kindled by the support of those who stood with him. The stars were still visible in the early morning sky as James Cooper stood on his porch, the air cool and crisp. The events of the night weighed heavily on him, the clash with the storm riders, the look of stunned fury on Python's face as the FBI hauled him away. It wasn't just a victory, it was the first clear sign that the gang's grip on Eagle's Rest could be broken. But James knew this was only the beginning. The bikers weren't operating alone, and their connections ran deeper than the town realized. Python wasn't the kind of man to orchestrate an operation like this. He was a pawn, and somewhere the real players were watching. James spent the morning checking his property. The tripwires and floodlights had worked as planned, but the encounter had left its mark. Scattered tools and evidence bag from the FBI agents littered the yard, and a faint patch of scuffed earth showed where the fight had taken place. James crouched beside it, his large hands brushing the dirt. "Got their attention now," he muttered. The sound of a truck approaching pulled him from his thoughts. He straightened, squinting into the sunlight as Marcus Shaw's vehicle rolled up. Marcus stepped out, his expression unreadable as he approached. "Morning," Marcus said, carrying a thermos of coffee. "Figured you could use this." James accepted it with a nod of thanks, pouring a cup into the lid. The warmth seeped into his hands as he sipped, the silence between them comfortable but heavy with unspoken questions. "They'll come back," Marcus said finally. James nodded. "I know, but it's not just them anymore. This operation's bigger than the Storm Riders." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You think their backers going to make a move?" "They have to," James replied. "The FBI taking Python was a blow, but it won't stop the pipeline. Whoever's behind this is going to react, and it won't be subtle." By midday, James and Marcus drove into town. The air was thick with tension, the events of the previous night already rippling through the community. At the market, vendors whispered in tight clusters, their eyes darting nervously toward the entrances. Ruth Whitaker waved James over as he passed her bakery stall. Her normally cheerful demeanor was replaced by a furrowed brow and pursed lips. "James," she began, her voice low, "people are talking. They say the bikers were here for more than just trouble. Something about guns?" James hesitated, his gaze drifting to the market crowd. Ruth was perceptive, and she had a way of hearing things that others didn't. "It's more complicated than that," he said carefully. Ruth's sharp eyes studied him. "You're not telling me everything." "I will," James promised, "but not yet." Her gaze softened slightly, and she reached out to pat his arm. "You take care of yourself, James. This town needs you." As they left the market, Marcus gestured toward the cafe on the corner. "Jenny's place. She hears a lot. Might be worth checking in." Inside, the atmosphere was subdued, the usual morning buzz replaced by hushed conversations. Jenny Parker greeted them with a warm smile, though her eyes betrayed her worry. "James, Marcus, coffee's on me today," she said, pouring them each a cup. They sat at the counter, watching as Jenny moved efficiently between tables. After a few minutes, she leaned over, her voice low. "Heard something strange this morning. A couple of guys came in asking questions, slick types, not local. Said they were insurance adjusters, but they didn't feel right." Marcus frowned. "What kind of questions?" "About you," she said, glancing at James. "Your farm, your equipment? Seemed like they were fishing for something." James exchanged a look with Marcus. It was too soon for the FBI's involvement to have spread this far. These men weren't federal agents. They were something else entirely. "Thanks, Jenny," James said. "Let me know if you hear anything else." Back at the farm, James reviewed the security footage from the night before. The cameras had captured everything the bikers approach, their disarray when the floodlights activated, and the swift takedown of Python and his crew. But it was something else that caught his attention now. A dark SUV had passed his property twice during the night, its headlights off. It had stayed just outside the perimeter, watching, but never stopping. "Surveillance," Marcus muttered, leaning over James's shoulder. "Whoever sent them wants to know what they're dealing with." James nodded, his jaw tightening. "They'll make a move soon." He pulled up another feed, this one showing the stretch of road leading to town. The same SUV appeared, parked at the edge of the woods. Two men stepped out, their figures barely visible in the low light. They wore dark suits and moved with the efficiency of professionals. "Not bikers," Marcus observed. "These guys are trained." James's mind worked quickly. The Storm Riders had drawn too much attention, and now their backer was cleaning up. Whoever these men were, they weren't here to negotiate. They were here to eliminate loose ends. That evening, James and Marcus prepared for what felt inevitable. They reinforced the barn doors and added new layers of security to the perimeter. James retrieved equipment from his hidden stash, tools and devices he hadn't touched since his Delta Force days. As they worked, the weight of the situation hung over them. "You ever think about why you stayed here?" Marcus asked, echoing his question from the day before. James paused, setting down a roll of wire. "I stayed because Elise loved this place. She saw the good in it, even when I didn't. After she passed, I didn't have much left to hold on to. This farm, it gave me purpose again. Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. That purpose is what's keeping this town together now, James. Don't forget that. The night was still and quiet, the kind of silence that carried tension like a taut wire. James and Marcus sat in the farmhouse, their eyes fixed on the security monitors. The hours dragged on, the anticipation growing heavier with each passing minute. Finally, just after midnight, the dark SUV reappeared. It stopped at the edge of the property, and two figures emerged. They moved swiftly, their actions precise as they cut through the fence and approached the barn. "Time to move," James said, his voice low. He and Marcus exited the house, their movements deliberate and silent. They approached the intruders from opposite sides, their steps muffled by the grass. The first man was crouched near the barn door, examining the locks. James moved behind him, his presence massive and sudden. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice like gravel. The man froze, his hand hovering over his belt. James grabbed him by the collar and yanked him back, pinning him against the barn wall. The second man turned, reaching for a weapon, but Marcus was already there. He disarmed him with a swift, practiced motion, sending the gun skittering across the dirt. "Who sent you?" James demanded, his grip tightening on the first man. The man gritted his teeth, refusing to answer, but his silence spoke volumes. The sound of distant sirens broke the tension. James had alerted Chief Anderson earlier, providing just enough information to ensure a quick response. The SUV roared to life, its driver speeding away, but Anderson's patrol car wasn't far behind. As the men were taken into custody, Marcus turned to James. "That was just a probe. They're testing us." James nodded. "Then we let them think we're just farmers holding the line. When they come back, we'll be ready." Back inside the farmhouse, James sat at the table, staring at the empty monitor. The stakes were higher now, and the lines were being drawn. He thought of Ruth, Jenny, and the rest of the town people who trusted him, who believed in him. For their sake, he couldn't afford to fail. James Cooper barely slept that night, the events of the last few hours weighing heavily on him. The two intruders had been taken into custody by Chief Anderson, but the SUV that fled hinted at a larger force waiting in the wings. The men weren't storm riders. They moved with precision, and their equipment had the unmistakable stamp of military-grade contractors. James sat in his living room, staring at the muted glow of the security monitor. He replayed the footage of the intruders' approach, analyzing their movements and tactics. They were testing him, feeling out the defenses. The real move would come soon. Marcus entered the room, his boots barely making a sound against the wooden floor. "Still at it?" James nodded, his broad shoulders tense. They weren't here to vandalize. They were gathering intel. This was just a step in their playbook. Marcus poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the wall. They know what they're up against now. That could mean they back off, or it could mean they hit harder. "They'll hit harder," James replied, his voice calm but resolute. At dawn, James and Marcus drove into town. The air was heavy with the residue of tension, the streets quieter than usual. The events of the past few days had unsettled Eagle's Rest. Vendors at the market spoke in whispers, their eyes darting toward every passing vehicle. They stopped at the cafe, where Jenny greeted them with a nervous smile. Her usual warmth seemed dimmed, the stress of the growing conflict evident on her face. "Morning," she said, pouring their coffee without asking. "I take it you've heard?" James raised an eyebrow. "Heard what?" Jenny glanced around, lowering her voice. Two strangers were seen at the gas station early this morning. Slick types, military bearing. Sound familiar? James and Marcus exchanged a look. "They say anything?" Marcus asked. Jenny nodded. "They were asking about you, James. Wanted to know about the farm, your routine. Seemed like they were fishing for something." James's jaw tightened. They're tightening the noose. Jenny hesitated before leaning closer. Be careful, James. People here trust you, but they're scared. You've got a lot riding on your shoulders. I know, James said, his voice steady. But this town's worth fighting for. After leaving the cafe, James and Marcus headed to the police station. Chief Anderson met them in his office, the lines on his face deeper than usual. He motioned for them to sit, his expression grim. I ran the IDs on those men we picked up last night, Anderson began. Both of them are ghosts, no real records, just scraps that don't add up. Mercenaries, Marcus said, crossing his arms. Looks like it, Anderson confirmed, and whoever hired them has resources. They had gear on them that isn't available at your average sporting goods store. James leaned forward, his hands clasped. You're keeping this quiet? As much as I can, Anderson said, but if these guys are connected to something bigger, it won't stay under wraps for long. James nodded. Keep the pressure low for now. If we spook them, they'll scatter, and we'll lose our chance to stop this. The drive back to the farm was quiet, both men lost in thought. James's mind churned with possibilities, each more dangerous than the last. The mercenaries, the SUV, the storm riders, all of it pointed to a coordinated operation. Think they'll move tonight? Marcus asked. Not yet, James replied. They'll regroup first, figure out what went wrong and plan their next move. That buys us time. Back at the farm, James set to work reinforcing the defenses. Marcus worked alongside him, their silence punctuated by the steady rhythm of hammering and sawing. As the sun began to set, Ruth Whitaker's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out with her usual basket of baked goods, her expression a mix of determination and concern. Evening, Ruth, James greeted, wiping his hands on a rag. I figured you'd be too busy to think about dinner, Ruth said, handing him the basket. She glanced at Marcus, who gave her a nod of thanks. You've got quite the operation going here, she observed, her sharp eyes taking in the floodlights and reinforced gates. Just being cautious, James said. Ruth gave him a knowing look. This isn't just about your farm, is it? James hesitated, then sighed. No, it's not. Ruth stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. You've always been the quiet type, James, but you've got a good heart. Whatever you're doing, don't lose sight of that. I won't, James promised. Night fell, and the farm settled into an uneasy quiet. James and Marcus took their positions in the farmhouse, watching the security monitors. The hours dragged on, the tension thick enough to cut. Just after midnight, the cameras picked up movement. 3 vehicles approached from the east: a van, an SUV, and a pair of motorcycles. They stopped just outside the perimeter, their lights off. They're here, Marcus muttered. James nodded, his gaze fixed on the screen. Let's see what they're after. The intruders moved quickly, cutting through the fence and spreading out across the property. They carried flashlights and equipment, their movements coordinated and deliberate. James and Marcus moved silently through the house, their training guiding every step. They exited through a side door, staying in the shadows as they approached the barn. The first confrontation was swift. One of the mercenaries crouched near the barn door, fiddling with a lock. James moved behind him, his massive frame casting a shadow that made the man freeze. Wrong property, James said, his voice a low growl. The man spun, reaching for a weapon, but James was faster. He grabbed the intruder by the arm, twisting it until the weapon clattered to the ground. A shout went up, and the others converged on the barn. Marcus intercepted one of them, his movements precise and efficient. The fight was brief but decisive, leaving 2 more mercenaries incapacitated. The remaining intruders retreated toward their vehicles, firing shots into the air as a distraction. James and Marcus held their ground, watching as the van and SUV sped away into the night. Back inside the farmhouse, James reviewed the footage. The attackers hadn't just been scouting, they had been planting something. He rewound the tape, his eyes narrowing as he spotted one of the men kneeling near the irrigation system. Looks like a tracker, Marcus said, pointing to the screen. James nodded grimly. They're trying to map the property. They want to know every inch before they make their next move. The secure phone buzzed, breaking the silence. James picked it up, reading the brief message. Confirmed shipment, 48 hours. Location compromised. Prepare alternative. He set the phone down, his expression hardening. The Storm Riders' backer wasn't just moving weapons, they were shifting their operation entirely. And Eagle's Rest was the linchpin. They're pulling out, Marcus said, but not without a fight. James exhaled, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Then we make sure it's a fight they can't win. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, James stood on the porch, his resolve steeling. The enemy was closing in, but so was the endgame. The quiet farmer that Eagle's Rest knew was gone, replaced by the man he had once been, a soldier prepared to defend what mattered most. The morning after the midnight intrusion dawned cold and gray. James Cooper stood at the edge of his farm, the wind pulling at his shirt as he studied the fields. The markers of the previous night's conflict were still visible. A section of the perimeter fence left ragged by bolt cutters, faint tracks in the dirt where the intruders had fled, and the faintly glinting tracker he'd found near the irrigation system. He knelt, prying the device loose with a pocket knife. The tracker was small and sleek, clearly military grade. Its presence confirmed what James had already suspected. The Storm Riders' backer wasn't just a criminal. They were professional. James walked back to the house, the tracker heavy in his palm. Inside, Marcus Shaw was already at the kitchen table, a map of Eagle's Rest spread before him. "Anything new?" Marcus asked, looking up as James entered. James held up the tracker. They're mapping the property, trying to get a tactical layout before they move again." Marcus frowned, taking the device and turning it over in his hands. "Military issue. They're not even trying to hide what they are anymore." "They don't need to," James said. "They think they've got us on the ropes." "Do they?" James looked out the window, his gaze distant. "Not yet." The day was spent preparing for the next encounter. Marcus worked on fortifying the barn, adding extra layers of protection to its doors and windows. Meanwhile, James combed through the security footage, looking for patterns in the intruders' movements. Mid-afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Chief Anderson's patrol car pulled into the driveway, its lights off. The chief stepped out, his face grim as he approached the farmhouse. "James," Anderson greeted, shaking his hand. "Mind if we talk inside?" James led him into the kitchen, where Marcus was still poring over the map. Anderson glanced at the cluttered table, but said nothing, his focus entirely on James. "We ran the plates on that SUV from last night," Anderson said, sitting down heavily. "It's registered to a shell company. No address, no real owner." "Doesn't surprise me," James replied, leaning against the counter. Anderson sighed. "There's more. My deputies found another tracker, this one near the town square. Whoever these people are, they're not just watching you. They're watching everything." Marcus straightened, his expression darkening. "They're preparing for something bigger." Anderson nodded. "I've got limited resources, James, and whatever this is, it's beyond what my department can handle." "Then we keep doing what we're doing," James said firmly. "We hold the line until we know what their next move is." As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields, Ruth Whitaker's car pulled into the driveway once again. She stepped out, a casserole dish in her hands, her expression a mix of determination and worry. "I figured you could use some dinner," Ruth said, handing the dish to James. He smiled faintly. "You're spoiling us, Ruth." "Someone has to," she replied, her tone softening. "How's everything holding up?" "Could be worse," James admitted. Ruth hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. "This town believes in you, James. Don't forget that." He nodded, her words settling over him like a quiet reassurance. Night fell, bringing with it an eerie stillness. James and Marcus took their usual positions in the farmhouse, the glow of the security monitors their only light. The hours passed slowly, each creak of the old house amplified in the silence. Just after midnight, the motion sensors triggered. A red light blinked on the monitor, accompanied by a faint beeping. "West perimeter," Marcus said, pointing to the screen. James leaned closer, his sharp eyes picking out 3 figures moving along the fence line. They were dressed in dark clothing, their movements deliberate and cautious. "They're testing us again," James murmured. The men split up, each taking a different route toward the barn. One of them carried a small device, likely another tracker. James and Marcus moved quietly, exiting through a side door and slipping into the shadows. James circled around toward the first intruder, his steps light despite his massive frame. The man was crouched near the fence, his attention focused on a handheld scanner. James struck quickly, grabbing the man by the collar and pulling him upright. The intruder struggled, but James's grip was unyielding. "Who sent you?" James demanded, his voice low and cold. The man gritted his teeth, refusing to answer. James pressed him harder against the fence, his patience wearing thin. "I can make this easy," James said, his tone sharpening. "Or I can make it very difficult. Your choice." Before the man could respond, a shout rang out from the direction of the barn. Marcus had engaged the second intruder, his movement swift and efficient. The third man turned to run, but James released the one in his grasp and took off after him. The chase was brief. James's long strides closed the distance quickly. He tackled the man to the ground, pinning him with one knee. "Not so fast," James muttered. By the time the confrontation ended, the 3 intruders were restrained and disarmed. James and Marcus brought them into the barn, where they secured them to a wooden beam. "Now," James said, folding his arms, "you're going to tell me who you're working for." The men exchanged nervous glances but remained silent. James knelt in front of the leader, his imposing presence filling the space. "You don't have to tell me everything. Just give me a name." The man hesitated, sweat beading on his brow. Finally he muttered, "Colton. The shipments come from Colton." James frowned. Colton was a small industrial town 2 hours west of Eagle's Rest. If the shipments were originating there, it meant the operation was more centralized than he'd thought. "Thank you," James said, standing. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" At dawn, the intruders were turned over to Chief Anderson, who promised to hold them quietly while the investigation continued. James and Marcus stood by the barn, watching as the patrol car disappeared down the road. "Colton," Marcus said, crossing his arms. "That's where they're running things?" "Seems like it," James replied. "But we'll need more than a name before we can act." "What's the plan?" James's expression hardened. "We take the fight to them." As the day unfolded, James began preparing for the next step. The storm brewing over Eagle's Rest was no longer contained to the town, it stretched beyond its borders, to places like Colton and whoever was backing the storm riders. This wasn't just about his farm anymore. It was about ensuring that Eagle's Rest and the people who called it home remained safe. James stood at the edge of his property, the wind tugging at his shirt as he gazed out at the fields. The fight ahead would be the hardest he'd faced yet, but he wasn't alone. And for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Elise's passing. Hope. The road to Colton stretched long and empty, winding through fields and forests that seemed to stand as silent sentinels. James Cooper sat in the passenger seat of Marcus Shaw's truck, the engine's steady hum a backdrop to the tense quiet inside. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked, breaking the silence. James nodded. "If Colton's the hub, we need to confirm it. Find out how deep this runs." "And if we stir up the wrong nest?" James glanced at him, his expression firm. "Then we deal with it." Marcus didn't press further. He knew James well enough to recognize the unyielding determination behind his words. Colton wasn't much more than an industrial outpost, a few blocks of warehouses, supply depots, and a main street that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. The air smelled of oil and machinery, and the few people they passed seemed cautious, their eyes lingering a moment too long before turning away. Marcus parked the truck in a lot behind a diner, its faded sign creaking in the wind. They stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The interior was dimly lit, with cracked vinyl booths and a counter that had seen better days. A waitress glanced up from her notepad, her tired eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the strangers. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat. James nodded, sliding into a booth near the window. Marcus sat across from him, his eyes scanning the room. They sipped their coffee in silence, their conversation low and casual, but their attention was sharp. James observed the other patrons, two truck drivers talking quietly at the counter, a man in a suit scrolling through his phone, and a worker in coveralls hunched over a plate of eggs. "Over there," Marcus murmured, nodding subtly toward the man in the suit. "Doesn't fit." James followed his gaze. The man's posture was too straight, his movements too deliberate. His expensive suit was out of place in Colton, and the faint bulge under his jacket didn't go unnoticed. "Mercenary," James said under his breath. Marcus nodded. "Question is, what's he doing here?" They left the diner after paying their tab, walking toward the row of warehouses on the town's outskirts. The air grew colder as they approached, the shadows of the buildings stretching long across the pavement. James stopped at the corner of a lot, crouching behind a stack of crates. He motioned for Marcus to follow, pointing toward a warehouse with a large loading dock. A truck was parked at the dock, its engine idling. Men moved quickly around it, loading crates marked with cryptic codes and symbols. "Looks like we found the distribution point," Marcus said. James pulled out a small camera from his jacket, snapping photos of the activity. He focused on the license plates, the markings on the crates, and the faces of the men handling them. One of the workers stepped aside to take a call, his voice carrying just enough for James to catch fragments. "Ahead of schedule. Shipments moving tonight. Backer wants confirmation." James's jaw tightened. Tonight's timeline wasn't a coincidence. The Storm Riders' backer was accelerating their operation, likely in response to the disruption in Eagle's Rest. They retreated to the truck, the photos James had taken now stored on a secure drive. As Marcus started the engine, James pulled out his phone and sent an encrypted message to Chief Anderson. "Colton confirmed. Shipments active tonight. Prepare local containment." "Think he'll be ready?" Marcus asked. "He'll have to be," James replied. The drive back to Eagle's Rest was tense. The discovery in Colton had shifted the stakes, confirming that the town was more than just a side note in the operation. It was part of a much larger web. As they approached the outskirts of Eagle's Rest, Marcus slowed the truck, his eyes narrowing at a parked vehicle up ahead. A black SUV sat just off the road, its windows dark and its engine running. "Think they're watching?" Marcus asked. James studied the vehicle, his instincts sharp. "Maybe, but we're not stopping to find out." They drove past without incident, though James could feel the weight of unseen eyes following them. Back at the farm, James and Marcus immediately got to work. James uploaded the photos from Colton onto his secure system, tagging each image with notes and coordinates. The crates, the faces, the vehicles, it was all evidence, but it wasn't enough to shut down the operation. "They're moving tonight," James said, his voice steady but grim. "We need more than just Anderson's deputies," Marcus replied. "If this goes hot, we'll be outnumbered." James nodded. "That's why I called in reinforcements." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "FBI?" "Not yet. Too risky. But there are others I trust." As the sun began to set, reinforcements arrived in the form of David Martinez. He stepped out of his car, his suit neat, but his demeanor sharp. "James," Martinez greeted, shaking his hand. "You've been busy." "You have no idea," James replied, motioning for him to follow. Inside the farmhouse, Martinez reviewed the photos and intel James had gathered. He whistled low, his eyes scanning the evidence. "This is bigger than we thought," Martinez said. "You're sitting on a powder keg." "Can you help us defuse it?" James asked. Martinez nodded. "I can coordinate backup, but it'll take time. You'll need to hold the line until we can move in." That night, the farm became a fortress. James, Marcus, and Martinez worked together, setting up additional defenses and ensuring every angle was covered. The perimeter was reinforced, the floodlights recalibrated, and the hidden surveillance systems optimized. As midnight approached, the air grew colder, the stillness heavy with anticipation. James stood on the porch, his hands resting on the rail as he stared into the darkness. "This is it," Marcus said, stepping beside him. James nodded. "They'll come hard. We have to hold." "Think we're ready?" James exhaled, his gaze unwavering. "We don't have a choice." The first sign of trouble came in the form of headlights cutting through the trees. A convoy of vehicles approached from the east, their engines low but purposeful. "They're here," Martinez said, his voice calm but focused. James nodded, his body tensing as he watched the monitors. The vehicles stopped just outside the property, and men began to disembark. They moved with precision, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. "Positions," James ordered. Marcus and Martinez took their places, the tension thick as the intruders advanced. The first clash was swift and brutal. James triggered the floodlights, bathing the field in blinding white light. The intruders hesitated, their formation faltering just long enough for James and Marcus to act. From the shadows, James moved like a force of nature, his massive frame a blur as he disarmed one attacker and neutralized another. Marcus covered his flank, his movements precise and lethal. Martinez coordinated from the farmhouse, relaying information through a secure channel. "Left flank moving. Watch the southwest corner." The fight raged on, the farm's defenses holding firm against the assault. James's years of preparation paid off, every trap and tactic slowing the enemy's advance. As dawn began to break, the intruders finally retreated, their numbers reduced and their morale shattered. James stood in the middle of the field, his chest heaving as he surveyed the aftermath. "Victory?" Marcus asked, stepping beside him. "For now," James replied, "but this isn't over." The dawn light revealed the damage left in the wake of the night's battle. James Cooper walked the perimeter of the farm, his boots crunching on trampled dirt. Fence posts were splintered, and faint scorch marks from makeshift flashbangs marred the ground. Despite the chaos, the property held, but James knew the fight wasn't over. Marcus Shaw emerged from the barn, wiping soot from his hands. "We held them off, but they'll be back." "They always come back harder," James nodded. "That's why we take the fight to them now." Marcus frowned. "You're talking about Colton." "It's the hub," James said. "If we shut it down, we cut the head off this snake." "Risky," Marcus muttered, "but it's the only way." Back inside the farmhouse, David Martinez was already working. He sat at the kitchen table, his laptop glowing as he pulled together intel. He glanced up as James and Marcus entered. "Good timing," Martinez said. "I traced some of the vehicles from last night. They all connect back to a warehouse in Colton, the same one you photographed." James leaned over the table, studying the map on the screen. "That's their distribution center," Martinez nodded. "And their Achilles heel. If we hit it, we disrupt their entire operation. But it won't be easy. They'll be on high alert after last night." James straightened, his gaze hard. "We'll need precision and speed. No mistakes." By mid-morning, the trio had formulated a plan. Marcus would provide backup and cover, while Martinez coordinated remotely with Chief Anderson to ensure local authorities stayed clear of the operation. James would lead the infiltration, using his knowledge of tactics and terrain to dismantle the hub from within. "Once we're inside, we move fast. James said. Neutralize their ability to transport, secure the evidence, and get out. Marcus nodded. And if things go sideways? James's voice was steady. We adapt. We survive. As night fell, the team prepared for the mission. James donned his tactical gear, the weight familiar and grounding. He checked his equipment with practiced efficiency, his movements calm but deliberate. Marcus loaded the truck with supplies, his usual humor replaced by quiet determination. Feels like old times, he said, handing James a flashlight. Except now we're defending a town, not a battlefield, James replied. Martinez secured a small communications device to James's gear. This'll keep us connected. If anything changes, you'll know immediately. The drive to Colton was silent, tension thick in the air. James sat in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the darkened horizon. Marcus drove with a steady hand, his jaw set. As they approached the outskirts of the industrial town, Marcus parked the truck in a shadowed lot. They exited quietly, moving on foot toward the warehouse. The area was eerily still, the hum of distant machinery the only sound. James led the way, his broad frame blending surprisingly well with the shadows. They reached the warehouse's perimeter without incident. James crouched behind a stack of crates, observing the guards patrolling the loading dock. Their movements were deliberate, their weapons slung low but ready. 4 on the outside, Marcus whispered. Probably more inside, James nodded. We take them quietly, no alarms. Marcus gave a grim smile. You got it. The first guard went down silently, James's hand clamping over his mouth as he dragged him behind the crates. Marcus handled the second with a precise takedown, the man crumpling to the ground without a sound. They moved toward the dock, slipping inside through a side entrance. The interior was vast, rows of crates stacked high against the walls. Forklifts sat idle, and the air smelled of oil and metal. James signaled for Marcus to hold position while he moved deeper into the warehouse. He kept to the shadows, his footsteps silent on the concrete floor. Near the back, he found what he was looking for, a set of crates marked with the same codes he'd seen in his photos. He pried one open, revealing rows of weapons, high-grade rifles, tactical gear, and electronic devices that shouldn't have been in private hands. Bingo, James murmured, activating his comms. Martinez, I've got the goods. Start recording the feed. On it, Martinez replied. As James documented the evidence, he heard footsteps approaching. He ducked behind a stack of crates, his pulse steady as 2 men entered the area. They spoke in low voices, their words clipped and professional. They're moving the shipment out tonight, one said. Boss wants it on the road before sunrise. James's jaw tightened. The timeline was shorter than expected, but it was all the confirmation he needed. He waited until the men passed before slipping back toward Marcus. Shipment's moving tonight, James said. We hit them now, or we lose our chance. Marcus nodded. Let's do it. The 2 men moved quickly, disabling the guards near the loading dock and securing the exits. James planted small charges on the forklifts and trucks, ensuring the equipment couldn't be used for transport. As they worked, Martinez's voice came through the comms. Heads up, I've got movement outside 2 vehicles inbound. James's pulse quickened. ETA? 2 minutes. Marcus, we're out of time. We need to finish this now, James said. Marcus nodded, setting the final charge. Done. Let's go. The escape was chaotic. The reinforcements arrived just as James and Marcus exited the warehouse, their headlights slicing through the dark. James led the way, his massive frame moving with surprising agility as they darted through the industrial lot. Behind them, shouts and gunfire erupted, the mercenaries realizing too late that their operation had been compromised. They reached the truck and jumped inside, Marcus flooring the gas as bullets pinged off the tailgate. The tires squealed as they sped away, leaving chaos in their wake. Back at the farmhouse, the atmosphere was tense but triumphant. Martinez reviewed the footage James had captured, his expression grim. "This is enough to blow the operation wide open," Martinez said. "But it's going to draw attention more than we've seen so far." James nodded. "Let them come. The more they push, the more they reveal." The night wasn't over. As James sat on the porch, his body aching from the mission, he thought of the town. Eagle's Rest was still in the crosshairs, but the fight was shifting. They had struck a critical blow, but the enemy was vast and connected. The coming days would bring new challenges, but for the first time, James felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they could weather the storm. The morning after the raid on Colton's warehouse was calm, but James Cooper knew better than to trust the silence. He stood on his porch, the sunrise casting long shadows across his fields. His gaze was distant, his mind replaying the events of the previous night. They had dealt a serious blow to the operation, but the retaliation would come swift and brutal. Marcus stepped outside, handing James a cup of coffee. "No movement on the cameras yet," he said, "but it's only a matter of time." James nodded, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "They'll regroup. Colton wasn't just a hub, it was a piece of something bigger." David Martinez joined them, his laptop tucked under one arm. "You were right about that," he said, setting the device on the porch railing. "The intel from Colton confirmed multiple nodes in their network. They're not just running weapons, they're building a system for regional control." James leaned over the screen, studying the map Martinez had pulled up. Each red marker represented a location tied to the Storm Rider's backer, spreading like a web across the state. "They've got too much invested to let this go," Martinez said, "and now they know you're the one who disrupted it." "Good," James said. "Let them come. It's time we finish this." The day was spent reinforcing the farm's defenses. The barn became a fortress, its walls lined with additional layers of metal and plywood. The perimeter was fortified with hidden traps, and every angle was covered by cameras or floodlights. As they worked, Chief Anderson arrived, his face set in a grim expression. He stepped out of his patrol car, motioning for James to meet him by the gate. "We've got a problem," Anderson said, lowering his voice. "My deputies intercepted a message encrypted, but we managed to decode part of it. They're coming tonight." James nodded, his jaw tightening. "How many?" "Enough to make this their last stand," Anderson replied. "And the town?" Anderson sighed. "I've got as many people as I can evacuating to the school gym. They'll be safe there, but we'll need every able hand here to hold the line." By sunset, Eagle's Rest felt like a ghost town. The streets were empty, the usual hum of activity replaced by an oppressive quiet. At the farm, James, Marcus, and Martinez made their final preparations. "This is it," Marcus said, adjusting the sights on his rifle. James glanced at him. "You ready?" Marcus grinned. "Born ready." Martinez activated the surveillance system, the monitors glowing softly in the dim light of the farmhouse. "We've got eyes on every approach. If they're coming, we'll see them." Just after midnight, the first sign of the assault appeared on the cameras. A convoy of vehicles approached from the south, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Trucks, SUVs, and motorcycles, more than a dozen in total. "They're bringing everything," Martinez muttered. James leaned over the monitor, his expression calm but resolute. "Let's give them a warm welcome." The convoy stopped just outside the perimeter. Men disembarked, their movements efficient and coordinated. These weren't just storm riders, they were professionals, the same type of mercenaries James had encountered before. A voice called out through a loudspeaker, "James Cooper, you've meddled in things you don't understand. Step outside, and we'll make this quick." James stepped onto the porch, his massive frame silhouetted by the floodlights. His voice carried across the field, calm and commanding. "If you want me," he said, "come and get me." The first wave of attackers moved in, their weapons at the ready. But James and his team were prepared. Floodlights illuminated the field, blinding the intruders and throwing their formation into chaos. Marcus opened fire from the barn, his shots precise and controlled. James moved through the shadows like a phantom, using his size and skill to take down enemies before they realized he was there. Martinez coordinated from inside the house, relaying positions and movements through their comms. North side, 3 moving toward the gate. "I've got them," Marcus replied, repositioning to cover the approach. The fight was brutal and unrelenting. The attackers came in waves, their numbers seeming endless. But James's years of preparation and tactical expertise turned the battlefield into a nightmare for his enemies. One by one, the mercenaries fell, their confidence eroded by the relentless defense. "You're out of your league," one of them shouted as he took cover behind a tractor. James appeared behind him, his voice cold and steady. "No, you are." By the time the sun began to rise, the attackers' resolve had crumbled. Those who could still move retreated, their vehicles roaring as they sped away. The field was littered with evidence-discarded weapons, abandoned equipment, and the groaning forms of the defeated. James stood in the middle of the field, his chest heaving as he surveyed the aftermath. Marcus and Martinez joined him, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "We did it," Marcus said, his voice heavy with relief. "For now," James replied, "but this isn't over." The hours that followed were spent cleaning up and securing the evidence. Chief Anderson arrived with his deputies, helping to detain the remaining attackers and catalog the weapons they'd left behind. Martinez compiled the footage and intel into a comprehensive report, ready to send to federal authorities. "This will blow their operation wide open," he said. James nodded, his gaze distant. "And make sure Eagle's Rest is off their map for good." By midday, the town began to come back to life. Families returned from the school gym, their cautious smiles a testament to their resilience. Ruth Whitaker arrived with a basket of food, her expression softening when she saw James. "You've done more than protect this town, James," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "You've given us hope." James smiled faintly. "This town gave me a home. It's the least I could do." That evening, James stood on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields. Marcus joined him, a beer in hand. "Think they'll come back?" Marcus asked. "Not after what we sent them running with," James replied. "But if they do, we'll be ready." Martinez stepped outside, his phone in hand. "The report's been sent. It's out of our hands now." James nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. "This isn't just about us," James said, his voice steady. "It's about showing people that they don't have to live in fear, that there's always a way to fight back." As night fell over Eagle's Rest, the town stood united, its people stronger than ever. And at the heart of it all was James Cooper, a man who had come to the quiet farmland seeking solace, only to find purpose and hope in the face of adversity. As the stars spread across the night sky over Eagle's Rest, the town stood resilient, its people bound by the strength and courage they had discovered in themselves and each other. At the heart of it all was James Cooper, a man who proved that even in the face of overwhelming odds, determination, kindness, and hope could illuminate the darkest times. This story reminds us all that it's never too late to make a stand, to protect what we love, and to rise stronger through challenges. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales of resilience, courage, and hope. Your support helps us bring more of these powerful stories to life. And stay tuned, because tomorrow we'll have another incredible story you won't want to miss. Hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.